Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Leong Center Trainee Hub. My name is Priscilla Medeiros. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization and Community Engagement Specialist at the center, as well as your moderator for today's Trainee Hub session. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for today. We're joined by Tatiana Bustos, who's a researcher and facilitator at the RTI International Transformative Research Unit for Equity. She applies participatory and equitable research and evaluation methodologies to design and implement projects that promote the inherent strengths, capacities, and opportunities of communities for social change. Her work includes projects focused on implementation of public health interventions, program development, initiatives for environmental justice, as well as health equity. Today's session will provide an overview of key components of program evaluation and core concepts of evaluation engagement, and explain why evaluation is needed to ensure continuous improvements to community engaged practice. So thank you very much. I'll pass things over now to Tatiana.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation and for having me today. So I'm going to quickly do some housekeeping items just to introduce myself and what we'll be talking about today. But thank you again for just being in community with me. So I will introduce myself, of course. So I'm Tatiana Bustos. So in addition to what Priscilla was graceful enough to share about my work, I'm also an implementation support specialist and a results-based accountability professional. And I'm also trained as a community psychologist. And so what that means is that a lot of my work is dedicated, like professionally trained. The lens that I bring into the process is dedicated to centering community needs, priorities, how can we capture multi-level contexts into the way that we design program evaluation and or research. So that's the lens that I'm bringing into this room today. I'm also, positionality is very important from where I sit. I sit in Washington State in the United States. And so we always like to open up with the identities that we hold and how that can often shape and influence what we perceive as important or tend to prioritize over other concepts. And so I am bridging community psychology with evaluation. I'm also a woman of color and like to leverage a lot of my lived experiences into the work that I design. And I would identify myself more as an interdisciplinary scholar. So because I have that community psychology training as well as evaluation, I also try to leverage other theories and models such as implementation science, research-based type of methodologies as well into the process. And so this is more, we call it like a kitchen sink type of approach to really making sure that our process for how we engage with others in our evaluations are systematic and evidence-informed, while also leveraging, the practice-based components of it. So the topic I'm talking about today, as Priscilla mentioned, is really program evaluation, what engagement means in that context, and how we can design an evaluation project that incorporates engagement along the way. And so I'm hoping to first start with what is program evaluation, to just share a little bit more about the evidence-informed literature on how we define it, and some of the core concepts of engagement. Then I'm going to share some frameworks I'm going to share 3 frameworks. There's lots of other ones, and I'll share more about that. But 3 key frameworks that I have used in my own work that can help you inform how you might incorporate engagement into your evaluation design, as well as the process. And I'm hoping that you'll leave with a better understanding of why we should evaluate community engaged practices along the way, as well as trying to apply those frameworks into your own projects. Okay. So maybe this is a little extra slide, but just kind of reiterating the sequence of which I'll be talking through items, program evaluation engagement, leave you with some frameworks. I'm going to walk through a case example from my own work using one of the frameworks so that you can walk away with something concrete. And then I have a group activity scheduled at the end of this session where I'll have you try to build out a project using one of the frameworks. So this is just very basic detail about what program evaluation is. And I want you all to think about these prescriptive details that I'm going to share in just a moment that define program evaluation, but also encourage you to expand it even further. So program evaluation is defined by the literature as being a really systematically based social research method where we're investigating either the effectiveness, the process, or the outcomes of a social program. It says social intervention program, but this could be a program initiative. It could be a certain dynamic or phenomenon that you're exploring. And what happens is when we do program evaluation is that these things are naturally occurring. It's not something that it's not like a randomized controlled trial. It's something that we are observing a program that's being implemented in its natural setting, and we want to know how it went. That's essentially the idea of program evaluation. And some of the core concepts of it I've highlighted here. So it's leveraging research methods, but it's not like, it's very different from research methods in the sense of generalizability, but it does use the same systematic processes. The purpose is slightly different from what you would think for research. It's really to understand how the program is functioning, or the intervention or initiative, whatever you might be studying, is functioning within the setting that you've implemented it in. So it's really about, are programs effective, or what are the barriers to that program? And it's a way to capture the outcomes or processes related to that. And then there's a why. So that is closely related to what we might do in research, where it's really about improving a social condition or improving the program itself so that it can be, so that it can improve social conditions in the future. And so there's this shared goal of why we do program evaluation. It's not just something that we do because we're contracted to do it, but we really want to improve the outcomes affiliated with the thing that we might be trying to capture. It's also an application piece. So this is another definition. Oops, sorry. This is another definition. They're saying very similar things, and I'm just sharing what the evidence tells us. The application of systematic methods to address questions about the operations piece, so the processes, the barriers, facilitators, and the results that are tied to that. They might also be based on social research methodologies and professional standards. So there are evaluation standards both in Canada and in the US through the American Evaluation Association, the Canadian Evaluation Association, on what evaluation needs to uphold in practice. And so this is another key component of evaluation that ties it to its professional field. And there are lots of argument, I'll also caveat, there's lots of arguments about whether evaluation is a field, a profession, or a methodology. And so it's still in development about where it stands. And there are some authors who actually push for it being all three of those. Like you need all three to be making the impact that you can through evaluation. So just giving you that insight. And I have the links to the Canadian Association and the American Evaluation Association, and I'll share that after I walk through the slides. So that's program evaluation. Those are the core concepts of evaluation. So how you would do it is using very similar approaches that you might do in research methodologies. Why you do it is not as exact as research, because at times we might be trying to inform the science aspect. For evaluation, it's really focused on the practice. Like, how can we improve this program to move towards the social conditions that we want to accomplish? So that why is a little bit different, although some research does push for that. And the other piece that's a little bit different is what it is that you study. So it's really tied to what we call the evaluand, the thing that's being evaluated, whether it's a program, whether it's a certain initiative, something has to have been implemented. And that's what you're trying to capture and understand. Whereas research, you might be trying to understand an experience just in society. So that might be a research topic that people try to understand. Evaluation is a little bit different in that sense. So those are some of the tenets of program evaluation. There are different types of evaluations that you might design in your own work, and they each have these different functions. And so you see here, the boxes outside are just the 4 different types of evaluation that are most common. There are also there's very many, if we get into the nuances of types of evaluation designs that are developmental, transformative, and there's actually a tree that I can share with you all later, that describes evaluation by its theories, methodologies, and so on. But these are generally the most common that you'll come across and that can be practical for your own work. So formative evaluation is trying to answer the question about how are we going to do this thing that we want to implement or that we want to create, how are we going to do it? And the activities that would fall under this are meant to inform the planning and how you would deliver the intervention or program at a later point. And so if we think about implementation science type of concepts, or we want to do a formative evaluation to determine whether this organization is ready to carry out this program, you might conduct a formative evaluation for that type of work. Then there's process evaluations, where it's really trying to answer the question, how did we do this? How are we doing it along the way? So were the activities that we did for that program in different settings, how did we make it happen? Was everyone doing the same thing? So this process evaluation really can be helpful in capturing that. Outcomes evaluation is exactly what you think it would be, trying to determine how well did we do, or how well didn't we do? What are the outcomes that are affiliated to this program? And in evaluation, we're trying to capture whether or not the program, initiative, or intervention has achieved the actual goals that you intended it that you designed it to achieve. And so an outcomes evaluation might be helpful there. The impact evaluation, I don't have, the impact evaluation is a little bit more challenging, because when we think about impact, it can actually take years to reach. So there are people who combine outcomes with impact, and it's a longer year, maybe a 5-year project. And it is important, it's not to undermine it in any way, but it is more challenging to do if you only have 1 year to fund an evaluation for a program or initiative. So I'm going to walk through each one just to give you more detail on what your questions might look like. So here's the formative evaluation, right? So we talked about how it's telling us the how. How are we going to do this? How can I prepare for the thing that I want to implement? And what types of designs you can do with a formative evaluation could be a needs assessment. So let's say, for example, you're not sure quite when the program should be implemented. And so you'll start asking questions to the organization or the group that you want to target with the program in order to inform that when you might implement. And so if the program has not been created yet, and you want to just understand whether there's a need, that you might conduct a needs assessment to capture that formative aspect of the work. The questions that you ask are really about, who would find this program helpful? What needs to be embedded in the program to make it helpful for that group? And how might we deliver the program in a way that reaches the audiences that we might want to reach? So it's really trying to capture all the details that you would need to prepare for the onset of that program or initiative. And again, I mentioned this is an early phase formative evaluation design. So it's not something hasn't been created yet, and you're just preparing for that work. It's the planning aspect. It's a planning evaluation. There's assessment of program theory. So when we say program theory, this is a conceptual model that tells us how the program is meant to function, or how it's supposed to be designed or implemented. And so we would have that ready. And it outlines what is this trying to achieve and how are we going to do that. So that's what program theory is. A formative evaluation can actually be used to assess that program theory. So we might use it. So this is at a point where you may have already done the program using the program theory, but you want to reorganize it. and you want to assess whether it needs to be clarified. Like, are there different pieces that are missing to the program theory? And so this is at a point where the program is the program is already developed. You may have already implemented it. Maybe it's in its pilot phase, and you want to make those iterations. So those are the two types of designs that you can use for the formative type of evaluation. Then there's a process evaluation. So as I mentioned earlier, this is trying to get to, how did we do this work? What strategies did we deliver for the program? And did everyone do the same thing, like to the extent of the activities? And the types of designs that you would use for this is really about, I think about the results-based accountability measures, where it's the percentage of meetings that the number of meetings you had or designed this program to deliver versus the percentage of meetings that were actually delivered in real time. And so how did we do, and are we doing what we said we would do? So those are the types of metrics that you would try to create in through the evaluation. And so it's trying to examine how the program is being delivered and implemented in real time. So it's not something that you have to do early on or after the program has been implemented, but you could apply this evaluation as you're delivering the program itself or intervention itself. So the answers that you get through a process evaluation is really about the efficiency of the process that you're doing. So do we have enough resources for the number of meetings that we had initially planned, or do we need to make changes? So it could be a matter of continuous improvement. A lot of process evaluations are actually used for continuous improvement. So we want to capture whether there needs to be changes made to ensure the success of the program in the longer term. And so you can also ask questions about reach. We plan to reach a certain number of community members from a specific background, maybe 100. Thus far, we've only captured 10% of that. And so what are the changes we need to make? And so a process evaluation here can be really helpful. And I have here a note about you would typically use a logic model to design this work, and I'll share more about what that logic model is. But that's the type of approach that you would be used that would justify the use of a process evaluation. Then there's outcomes evaluation. So I mentioned earlier, this is exactly what you think it means. What did we actually accomplish? What happened? So this is not at the beginning. This is a program that we've already implemented. It was supposed to improve educational outcomes, or reading levels and educational outcomes. Now I want to design an outcome evaluation to determine whether it did indeed make that change, and in what way, and what other changes can we capture? So that's the type of question approach that you'd be using for an outcome evaluation. For the outcomes evaluation, this is where social science research methodology can be helpful, because it's essentially what you would do with a typical research design. So there's not necessarily a specific evaluation approach that I would offer here, but you can apply, quantitative, qualitative data, pre-post assessments, interviews. That's the type of data collection activity that you would apply here. Then the last piece is impact. So getting to the longer term social change. What did we address the ultimate problem that the program was designed to address? And usually this is harder to accomplish with the current funding that you might have, because you might have a year funding, but the impact is really trying to get to that larger system goal. So I just have here a summary. So this is with impact, we're trying to assess whether we made a difference, and how has that difference changed the experiences of people, if that was your ultimate goal. And so with impact, it's actually very important to have a conversation with either your community partners or the populations that you're involving in that program to try to understand what impact means. And so this is also tied to the logic model. that I'll share in just a couple slides, but the logic model outlines what the outcomes are versus the impact, because they are very different. The outcomes are more achievable. So as you're thinking about these different evaluation approaches, I put a couple of decision points that are important for you to consider. So what is ultimately the purpose that you want to accomplish with your evaluation? Is it to develop an initial program? Is it to capture outcomes? Like, what is the purpose that you're trying to accomplish through your evaluation? Understanding the readiness of the program is also important. So this is both in the sense of, is this program ready to implement a certain, or is this organization, excuse me, ready to implement this program or initiative? And is this organization also ready to capture the reality of an evaluation? That is, if they find out that the program doesn't work, are they ready to have that conversation, to make changes? Are they prepared to make changes to improve the program? So those are the aspects of readiness that are important to consider as you're thinking about this evaluation. And how are you going to use the information? So let's say you do conduct a needs assessment, you find out all this information. What is it that you're going to use it for? What would be most useful for the goal, for the purpose that you're trying to meet? So there's some questions that I use myself as I'm trying to develop an evaluation and which one is most appropriate. And then I have a slide here on the right, thinking about engagement in that process. And we'll get into this more, but really looking at engagement across different levels where we might be just seeking information from people, which is typical, or we might move towards a more collaborative aspect of this. What makes most sense for the evaluation? It should be part of your decision points when you're trying to decide on which evaluation to apply. So I have really quick slides. This isn't the center of the topic, but what is a logic model if you haven't seen it before? It's really helpful if you're designing an outcome and impact evaluation. It's describing the overall program itself, what it's meant to accomplish, what is the impact that's intended to achieve, and it sequences the program structure. It outlines the activities that you might have, the outcomes that are affiliated with those activities, and so on. So it's really helpful to just have as a guiding post for what you might be evaluating. And I have a sample here about where the process and formative typically fall over, and then the outcome and impact evaluation. And so for the formative evaluation and process evaluation, it's more so on the inputs and activities piece. So the inputs are what you put into a program to be implemented. So it's really preparing, like, does it have the resources that it needs to be successful? So that might be part of your planning, the formative piece. The formative evaluation might be helpful there. The activities are, this is what you hear, they're the planned activities that are connected to the program. So we want to conduct X number of workshops and deliver X number of services with facilitators and partners. So in a process evaluation, would be able to assess the extent to which all activities were implemented, the percentage of the activities delivered, or the activities planned versus delivered. And so those are just, it's a very helpful map for you to determine where the evaluation might fit best, what kind of evaluation might fit best. Then on the right column are the outcomes and impact. So here, outcomes has different terms, and it's a little bit complicated, but short-term outcomes are things like staff capacity or staff knowledge, things that might be easier to change at an organizational level versus impact, which is more tied to a structural change like policy. And so I strongly advise that we apply a logic model as we're thinking about program evaluation in our work, just to make sure that we are understanding the key components. So you can think of this as like the key ingredients of the program itself. And it's also a live document. So just because I have all these things listed here doesn't necessarily mean that this is the program and it's not going to change. But in fact, you can actually have conversations with the people that are delivering the program or the people who are affected by the program to make changes to this document so that it's more accurate as to how to more accurate to how it's functioning on the ground, like in the real world. So that's just another helpful way to plan for your evaluation, thinking about the activities and the outcomes and impact. So I have a break in the next slide, but I think I'm going to keep going and hold off till the end of the hour. Is that okay, Priscilla?
Absolutely. Keep going.
All right. Okay. So the next section I'm going to move on to is on evaluation engagement. So I gave you like the really prescriptive way of understanding what program evaluation is, what kind of options you have available to you, and how do you make a decision about which one fits best. So now I'm going to walk us through what is evaluation engagement. And evaluation engagement is a very specific concept in the context of evaluation. And there's very limited work in terms of research on evaluation engagement. It's something that I'm actually trying to build out. It means different things to different people. So I will be defining it in the next slide, but I hope that you understand how important it is to develop a common understanding of what we mean when we say evaluation engagement, because I know a lot of you are interested in engaging people and embedding that into your own work. But what does that really mean for the project that you're designing or the evaluation that you're designing? So what is evaluation engagement? I found this very broad definition. There actually is not an agreed upon term. Many people define it differently based on the populations that they work with, the partners that they have, which is fair and totally accurate. But if we try to leverage what we know based on the research and evidence, it's very broad, and there's room for it to grow. So it's an interesting concept. And when we say evaluation engagement, we're all thinking these different things. I myself think of it as part of evaluation practice. It's a core component of evaluation practice. And so when I think of it, I think of people first and foremost. You know, we know that we're involving people in some way. But who that person is varies, right? You might think it's the recipient of the intervention, or the program implementer, the person who's delivering the intervention. Some people may think of people most directly impacted, to who has been furthest from decision-making power, or the funders. And so it's really important that we all get on a common page about who we mean when we say people engaging in the work, people that were engaging in the work. There's also another core component of evaluation engagement are the activities that you do. So if you are inviting people to engage in your project or in your evaluation design, what are the activities that you're going to have them do? So what are they actually going to be involved in? Is it decision making? Is it just reporting information out and then possibly considering it in your design? There's just these different points of activities that range in terms of how much power they have as you're inviting them into the process. And it's really important to be mindful of that. There's also different points when we might engage people. So for example, some evaluators may engage them at the beginning of the project, of the evaluation. You may have the funding, and the general scope, but you don't necessarily have the questions or the type of design. And so you would invite the community or whoever it is that you're involving in that work early on to brainstorm. So it's a real thought partnership with the person that you're involving. Or there are others who engage people towards the end of the evaluation. So their team has done all the work, everything's been decided on, and now they just want to know what people think about the results toward the end. And there's also a combination of the two. So there's different perspectives as to when we need to involve people in evaluation engagement. And very broadly speaking, the research on evaluation literature defines it as participation of program community members, so those who have a vested interest, which is still very broad, both in the evaluation and or the results of the evaluation, and has a range of different audiences, and it could be in any phase of the evaluation. And so this is broad, but a good guiding post for how you might be thinking about evaluation engagement in your own project. So I did I've done a lot of scoping on this concept in evaluation literature. So that's why I'm sharing some of this work, because it is very interesting to me. And I apologize if it's not interesting to you, but a lot of people talk about evaluation engagement in, their reported studies, their technical reports. So it is actually, there's been a systematic review on this, and it's one of the most discussed components of evaluation. You'll see it commonly described, but there's not enough detail to describe how the person did it. So I could read one report that says engagement, another report that says engagement, and not necessarily know what that looked like in both of those studies or both of those reports. So there's no consistent criteria for the quality of engagement that we may be delivering in our work, in our evaluation. And there's lots of room to grow. And I'm just sharing this with you so that you could be mindful of both what is it that you're thinking about as you're planning for that engagement in your evaluation design, and what quality are you being guided by to ensure that the engagement that you are using or applying is ethical, meaningful, collaborative. What are the criteria that you're using for yourself as an evaluator to engage with people in a meaningful way? So there's just a lot of underreported key elements and things that we just don't get a chance to share collectively as a field yet. So this is just reiterating some of the key points from a recent systematic review. And I'm also trying to build out an updated literature search on this, but there's generally across reports of evaluation, there's lack of involvement from who is most directly impacted. So evaluations tend to involve the programmer, that it might be the director of the organization, rather than the population that's most directly impacted. Think about equity groups or communities that have been historically marginalized. They are not often involved in evaluation. There's also no information in terms of whether one evaluation design used the same extent of involvement of the other. So going back to the point I made regarding the implications of power and how you involve people, whether you're just asking them questions or they're partnering with you on the design, that has a lot of implications for how the extent of shared power in their involvement. And there's just very little information in terms of how much one evaluation is doing versus the other. We don't have that information. There's also limited reporting on what are the expectations of others when they get involved with you in that evaluation design. So for example, if I want to engage community members from a certain neighborhood, I wouldn't often, this is just not me, this is just an example. Many evaluation projects don't have questions regarding their expectations of involvement. So people are getting involved, but they're not having the opportunity to communicate what their expectations are for getting involved in that process with you. And that's really important. Like, people's perspectives are very highly underrated, undervalued in this space. And it's really important that we think about that as we're deciding on which evaluation design to apply. And I mean, this is a given at this point, but there's very limited empirical data that can help inform us on making all these decision points regarding quality, how involved should they be, how should I report expectations. There's no systematic evidence or guidance on that available to us. And so with that leaves lots of challenges to evaluation engagement. So when we think about all the gaps that remain just based on the evidence and gray literature, that leaves a lot of challenges in our practice. So in the real world, when we start designing these evaluations with community members, we start to run into issues regarding decision-making. So because we don't have an established structure that's set for decision-making, it can be difficult to manage when you have a project that's inviting people into the process. And this is very common if you haven't done evaluation engagement in the past. This is very common in any type of collaborative type of evaluation that you might do. people have competing priorities. We might engage one party who has a very different perspective and just is more in power, based on their social identities, and that can present issues. And how do you set a structure for decision making there? And so we're often faced with this problem of making decisions collectively that are fair, that are inclusive, and there isn't a guidance for that. It continues to be the reality of challenges if you are considering doing this in your own work. And what I would advise doing, and I've written about this, is when we're thinking about decision making, is to start with relationships first and establish a really strong foundation so you can navigate those tentative issues that may come up in terms of prioritization and learning how to negotiate through those differences. Then there's the issue related to when to engage, right? We know it's meaningful. Well, I think it's more meaningful to engage people earlier on in the evaluation that you might be developing, but oftentimes that's not feasible. It's not feasible because of funds or the time you have, or maybe I can't reach the audiences that I want to reach. And so that's presenting additional delays. And that is very common in these types of projects where you want to invite people to partner with you along the process. And one solution that is available to us is to really think about that planning time that is needed. So if you are considering engaging your partners in your evaluation or partners in your evaluation project, think about leaving 2 months, or especially if it's a new relationship, 2 to 3 months to start building relationships out with the community in some way. And there are different ways that you can do that, but just thinking about that planning time for relationship building will be important. And then when we get into engaging, if we just continue to navigate that challenge and we get to a point where we engage people later on in the process, it doesn't really set up the program or evaluation for success. And we end up not setting up the communities that we're trying to involve for success because they're not aware, they don't have decision-making power to the extent that you do. And so it can just, if you're just involving them at the end, it's great that you presented the opportunity, but with that comes additional challenges that you'll need to navigate. The issue of fairness in participation is a major concern as we're doing this in practice. And these are all things that I've experienced directly. But there are some ways to make sure that the project is still successful, right? So in fairness and participation, this is referring to who you invited. Like, who did you want to get involved in your project? There's some implications of that in terms of fairness. Did everyone get a chance, and why not? Who got selected? Why were they selected? There's also issues of representation. So if we have certain members at a decision-making table, what implications does that have for whose voices are represented or who gets to speak up for which group? And so it's very important that we're considering reach when we're thinking about planning engagement and evaluation, and ensuring that we've thought through community partners or members or organizations with vested interests in different ways, not just the ones with the most power, but thinking of those who have been most directly impacted and not necessarily involved in any decision making, especially because we're thinking about program effectiveness. Like, it ultimately impacts them the most. So it makes sense for me, in my perspective, to engage them throughout the project. The other piece is also about conflicts. So I mentioned earlier regarding competing priorities. So there are these very fair conflicts that you will run into in evaluation engagement in terms of the evaluation that you've been funded, like, so the funding mechanism that supports the evaluation itself and or the organization versus what the community wants you to do or what the community is prioritizing. So there are at times some conflicts regarding those priorities. And so it's really important to be mindful of that and the reality of what it is that you can change. So if you are engaging people, is the purpose of that to make the evaluation more responsive and capture their needs? And is it feasible for you to do that given the scope of work that you're involved in with the funder? And the last two are also more common now than ever in the US especially, and as I'm sure in your work in Canada and other places, but just thinking about evaluation as having these historical nuances that can be tied to trauma and how that leads to mistrust. So I've experienced wanting to invite communities to an evaluation with me and engage as a partner, but there's a lot of hesitation with what evaluation might mean, with what evaluation has done in the past in their community, where it might not have led to sustainable solutions. And so really navigating that as part of this work is important, and recognizing it as well. And then language justice, just thinking about is if we are engaging people in our evaluation, are we ensuring that how we've explained concepts and how we've created products or meetings are accessible to them? So it's just really important that we be mindful of those pieces as we're wanting to engage people in our evaluation designs. And so this is just a plug. There's a book from the Western Michigan University where I shared some of my practice-based experiences in navigating evaluation engagement related to those challenges, and what some solutions can be done, though it's still a murky area that a lot of us are collectively trying to navigate together as a field. And it's what I'll leave you with is to being mindful. Like if you are thinking about engaging communities in your work, in your evaluation especially, it's great, but just because you engage them doesn't necessarily mean that no harm is going to be done to those groups or to those communities. There's still a lot of work that needs to be developed in that engagement process itself. You know, going back to the limitations that we see in the literature, research on evaluation that's using engagement, we don't have an understanding of their expectations or their perspectives of how the process went, of where they would like to be involved. And that is ultimately what's perpetuating these issues with challenges and some unintentional harm that may be led through that process. So I will pause here. There's a lot of big concepts. Before I get into evaluation approaches with community engagement, I just wanted to pause here for any questions, and if not, we could take a break.
I did have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it is maybe not recommended to have multiple types of evaluation kind of in one survey. So how you had the process evaluation and the outcome evaluation, like is it recommended to not have questions from both categories on one survey, for example?
Oh, I see. So the logic model, let me get there. Is this what you mean?
Yes. Yeah, like if I were to ask a question related to like the delivery of services they received and the short-term outcomes on the same survey, is that recommended against, or is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I would think about the purpose. So these are two different types of designs. So usually it's not just a question. You're designing, like for an outcomes evaluation, you're designing the entire evaluation to capture outcomes. So it might be outcomes related to the activities, like what changes did you make? So that would be separate than if you're trying to understand the extent to which certain activities were delivered. That would be the focus of a process evaluation. So they both have very different purposes, but they might overlap in that sense, where you're looking at outcomes of the things here in these columns here, of the activities or the outputs. So that's how it might overlap, but I wouldn't design both. They will serve a different function.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I see a question from David as well.
Yes. Thank you for that talk. That was excellent. I'm doing my PhD in evaluations at U of T, and I wish all my professors were as clear as you. That I learned a lot. Thank you. I did just have a question around something you alluded to around fairness on who to include.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I struggle with, in that like conducting some of an evaluation project, and I want to include like certain community members. However, I struggle between selecting like community leaders that I think it's important to recognize their, their devotion to the project and whatnot, but I also don't want to only have that demographic in like represented in the patient engagement aspect. So how do you balance that dance between getting the leaders and recognizing their hard work, but also wanting the people that are actually on the ground level and getting them involved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there is no direct answer to resolve it. I think we all struggle with that. And I mean, to this day, I have a lot of colleagues. I mean, we always talk about this, when we think about work groups or the issue of where the evaluation is being funded. Like sometimes it just makes sense to include people most accessible to you, the time that you have. So there's all these like external factors that are out of your control at times. And what you can do is just being thoughtful about, did your recruitment, did you, your outreach strategy, did your recruitment letter go out to intentional audiences, like a listserv that reaches those community members on the ground? Or did you go to an event? What was the additional work that was done to make that process intentional to reach those audiences? So, and that's something that you can do, is being mindful and just setting that time for yourself to do that. But then out of your control is really who gets to respond, like who actually responds to the recruitment letter that they want to be part of the process. That's something that is just not in your control. And I oftentimes end up with the key decision makers of the organization, but I always try to reframe this as it's a starting conversation. Maybe we can have this conversation with the leaders and encourage, a listening session with external audiences. So those are some ways. It's really a matter of thinking creatively, and not being tied to those bounds, to that box. Yeah, so that's what I would share.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Yeah, of course. All right, any other questions before we take our break? Those are really good questions. Karis, I see your comment. Let's see. Yes. Yeah, I didn't get too into it, but relationship building is a major component, and it's not as in the next section, I'll explain some frameworks that really center relationship building along the way, but there's room for growth in making all evaluations this way, but there's lots of differing perspectives on that. But I totally agree, especially for certain populations that have cultural values tied to trust and relationship building.
Okay, perhaps we'll take a break at this time and then reconvene for the continuation of your presentation, as well as the activity you've planned for us, Tatiana. What do you think? A 5-minute break, a 10-minute break, just to stretch our legs, grab a glass of water? What are your thoughts?
5 minutes works. Is that good? What do you usually do?
Normally we give about 5 to 10, so perhaps we'll do 5 minutes. So I'm looking at my clock now. Let's reconvene at 1:56 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll continue with this conversation. All right, see you back in about 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. We're back from that short break. I'm just going to pass things back to Tatiana so she can continue her presentation.
Thank you. Okay, hopefully that was enough time. So thank you so much for just your continued attention. We are going to switch into, so I'll reiterate how these key concepts that I just walked us through tie into the next section on evaluation approaches with community engagement. So I explained, some of the core pieces of program evaluation which are important to understand because there are all these different designs and functions that you can ultimately use an evaluation for. And so just making that decision about which one is most appropriate for the goal that you're trying to accomplish. Then I talked to you about evaluation engagement, shared some of the limitations and growth opportunities that we have as evaluators, as the field, to really improve how we're doing engagement in practice, regarding who's involved, how we're involving them, and what we have them doing along the way, as well as reporting it to our broader field and or the program implementers themselves in some way. Just making that information more transparent is important. Now, there are evaluation approaches that embed those two concepts of program evaluation and evaluation engagement. It doesn't resolve the issue of what we're seeing with engagement in terms of who and fairness and mistrust and all those things, but it does embed that relationship building aspect as the center of the evaluation design itself. And so if you could think of these slides as layers. So I gave you the basics of program evaluation. You have to understand the function, what you're wanting it to accomplish, what kind of questions. Then if we want to layer that with engagement, there's some approaches out there that have it across the phases of an evaluation cycle that you would typically apply in your work. So I'm going to walk through only four. There are lots of evaluation approaches out there. I'm not an expert by all means in all of them. I've applied these that I'm going to be sharing with you. I'm actually sharing three, sorry. I got rid of the other one. So there are three that I'm sharing with you. So there are lots of other types of evaluations, and there are other evaluation approaches that may not have relationship building at the center, like engagement at the center, but you can adapt as needed. But these are intentionally designed for inviting partners along the way, making changes to the design based on their cultural preferences and things like that. So that's what I'm going to be walking through in the next few slides. Okay. So the approach is really a step-by-step guide for how you would design your evaluation with engagement along the process. So that's what the approach is trying to outline for you. And so it's not always necessary to have an approach if you're designing your evaluation. Oftentimes I don't see one at all. But if you are centering values of cultural responsiveness, community priorities, trust, relationships, it is helpful to leverage existing approaches that already have those values in place as part of their design process. So there are these three approaches here. I thought I had four. I think I walked through three. So these three approaches I've used in my own work. There's culturally responsive evaluation from Stafford Hood. It's a very classical approach that's embedded in wanting to understand the narratives of communities that we're involving, and it's based on critical race theory and wanting to upend these traditional paradigms of how we might do an evaluation generally from the beginning. And so it's a very, very, and I do it no justice, it's a very powerful evaluation design that has ultimately changed how we do evaluation in a way that centers the voices of marginalized communities. And there's also a reference to Stafford Hood as being the founder of this framework, or this approach, excuse me. So I encourage you to take a look at how he and his team explain the core concepts, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. But this has been a long-standing approach that is been phenomenal in centering the cultural background of the communities that you're trying to work with. Then there's participatory evaluation. So participatory evaluation was around since, I think, 90s, since 90, I want to say 94, maybe it's 95. It's also a very well-known evaluation approach that doesn't necessarily consider cultural backgrounds, but it does incorporate shared decision-making of the members that you're trying to involve in your evaluation design. Then there's community-based participatory research principles. So their community-based participatory research principles are not necessarily an evaluation approach. That's something I'm trying to push right now in terms of the field of evaluation, and thinking about how community-based participatory research principles can be a guiding approach for how we might conduct evaluations. Because I won't get too into it, but because it ultimately has these values that are centered in wanting to be equitable in our partnership processes, in working towards justice. And I view them as the missing pieces. And I have a slide that shows you what those principles are. Probably doesn't make sense right now, but my view is that these principles can really help address some of the gaps that we may be seeing in our evaluation design when we do engagement with others in practice. Then there are all these there's an umbrella of evaluation approaches that get to these different pieces. There is no perfect one, but there are other options. And I mentioned earlier that you can adapt. If you do like a certain evaluation approach, like developmental evaluation is very convenient, you can combine it and adapt it with culturally responsive evaluation by just embedding some of the steps into the process, but the paradigm is a little bit different. So I'm going to walk through. It was probably just Mama Jova, but I'm going to actually walk through what these approaches look like, and then give you an example from my own work. So this is the CRE, stands for Culturally Responsive Evaluation. Apologies for the acronym. So culturally responsive evaluation provides these step-by-step processes that you would apply into your own work. The first that you see here is preparing for the evaluation. So that goes back to what I showed you earlier about some of the key points that you need to decide on, like what's the use of this evaluation, what's the purpose that we're trying to meet. But there's this, oh no, okay. I have another slide that shows how 1 and 2 is actually interactive. As you're preparing for the evaluation, there should be these conversations that you have as you're engaged with the partners that you're engaging with, so that the planning piece can be inclusive of what they need. And so my arrow did not make it into this slide, so apologies there. But the next step, according to Stafford Hood's theory or culturally responsive evaluation approach, is that we need to engage partners. Once we understand what the evaluation is ultimately designed to do, that's when we begin to engage. I think we should do that as we're figuring things out as part of step 1. The next step following that is identifying the purpose of the evaluation, framing the questions, designing the evaluation, all these key concrete steps along the way. But at the center, there's this big circle of culturally responsiveness. And what that means is that as you're preparing for the evaluation, let's go back to step 1. As you're preparing for the evaluation, you're actually planning the core pieces of the evaluation design with consideration of what works for the people that you're trying to reach. And it's a little bit hard to illustrate that without the example, and I have an example later on in this presentation, but the idea is that if I want to prepare this evaluation, I need to understand this community. I'm in Washington, I live in Puyallup. If I want to try to implement an evaluation, I'm designing an evaluation for the library, I really need to understand what goes on in Puyallup. How are people using that library? You know, what are some anecdotes? So how long has the library been there? And that goes into my preparation. So I'm really trying to design this work in a way that aligns with the cultural context that I'm working with. And I mentioned the libraries, but it's essentially always a specific priority population, like a population group, that equity group that you're working with. So this is really helpful if I think it's a phenomenal approach. I would advise applying this in your own work. I know someone mentioned Indigenous populations, so there is a specific Indigenous framework that I'm just not familiar. I haven't used it in my own work, but it's also longstanding that has different core values, part of these step-by-step processes in the center. So there are different types of approaches similar to this that center the values or cultural context of the communities that we're trying to reach. And the idea is that those values, that context is at the center of our work. And we're trying to embed it into all these other steps that will help make our evaluation more successful. Then so that's one. And I'll walk through what that looked like in one of my projects. Then there are these values or principles of community-based participatory research. So if you're not familiar with CBPR, hopefully some of you are, but there are these 9 core principles. One of the first being, and they're not in sequential order or anything like that. This is just how I organize them, but the first listed here is viewing communities as units of identities. So we want to think about the communities that we're trying to reach as having their own cultural communities. So I've often run into some of my work in Flint where I'm doing outreach with nonprofit organizations, nonprofit organizations who are part of the community, but some community members may have conflicts with those nonprofit organizations. So there's this cultural world within community as I understand it, you know, but once I go into the community, there's all these different levels. And someone else, I forgot your name, I think it was David, mentioned, you know, these different levels of community related to leaders and folks on the ground. And so this principle really gets at wanting to understand communities as having those different nuances. There's these different levels. Communities are also part of a system. The second here is building on community assets and resources. So what this means is that we want to design something, or in community-based participatory research, we want to design something that is centered on assets, what's already working well in communities that we can leverage in our design. What are some resources that they have? You know, is there, I think of faith-based organizations who have really strong relationships with community members. Is there a way to partner with them to do outreach together? You know, so that's really what this principle is trying to get at. And I think it can also be applied successfully in an evaluation design. Pursuing mutual benefits for the evaluator and all relevant partner groups. So this is a principle that gets to accountability. So if we're engaging with people in our evaluation project, it's very important that we set mutual benefits. It's not just about what we get out of it, of that partnership, but also what gains they have. Whether it's for their community, whether it's professional development training for them as participating with you on this work, or something else. It's just really important to establish some kind of mutual benefit. This ties into the idea of fostering co-learning and capacity building. So we want to design something that isn't necessarily us generating this knowledge from people and being extractive. We want it to be a co-learning process that's informing how we engage with them, or we're building out their capacity in some way. Maybe you invite them to collect data with you, and you give them training on how to use data collection tools or a data management system. So that's the general idea behind this principle. Being explicit about incorporating feedback in your design. So as we're engaging with people in our evaluation projects, we don't want to just engage them and never ask them how it's going. That's horrible. We always want to be open to feedback and ongoing feedback throughout the process, so that we're continuing to develop this evaluation that shows authentic partnership by us listening to what works better for them or what's not working well, and being just iterative and open to embedding any changes that are necessary to your project. Local relevance and social issues, that's something that's common across all of evaluation, right? We want to make sure that we're improving some kind of social condition. And then the other few principles get to transparency and what we might be finding throughout the work, this idea of equitable partnership. So it's not just, and that gets to the point of involvement. We want to ensure whatever involvement that we do have people, that it's equitable to the extent that's possible. And not just at the beginning, but across the project phases. That's one of the core principles of CBPR, of community-based participatory research. And then the last piece, the last principle here is having a focus on long-term processes. We're committed to not just going into the community and engaging them in this evaluation, and then once the project is done, we're good to go. I will never see you again. That's not what we want to do if we're embedding community-based participatory research principles. What we want to do is start these conversations with potential partners and thinking about the longer term. This is a longer term relationship that we're vested in building for continuation of other projects, or maybe something else that we might be working towards together. That's what the principle pushes for evaluators. And so the way that you would apply this is, you could apply the same, you could apply the same designs. Let's say you're embedding a survey, or a mixed method survey with interviews. But if you can apply these principles into that overall process in the way that you might be open to feedback, or in the way that you're sharing the design of the survey themselves. Are you inviting community members to add or change questions or collect the data with you? So these principles are very applicable to different general designs. Then there's participatory evaluation. It's very similar to the principles that I just shared. It's a specific, it was actually developed in a different space that's not community psychology, which I think is interesting, but it does fit into community-based participatory research. At least that's from what I've read. But the participatory evaluation asks these 3 core questions that you see here. And the idea behind it is that we're involving community members throughout the scope of the project, not just at the beginning, but throughout. So that's where it's very similar. It is based on very similar principles, and it's asking who gets to control the design of the work. That's really what it's trying to get to. And so by control, it's thinking about decision making. So if we're involving people, who controls what questions get to be asked? Or how the questions get to be responded, and who gets to respond them to, or what kind of data source will we be using? So it's just all the matter of the design, who controls those design aspects of the work. And then there's who participates. So who is it? And this gets to David's question about leaders, people on the ground. Participatory evaluation really has us think about who are we allowing to participate, and are we inviting? Is it just evaluators? Is it just funders? Or are we inviting people who are affected by the program itself? And then how much in terms of the phase. So is it just at the beginning? Is it just at the end? Are we being collaborative, or is it just an input session? In terms of when we're designing something, are we just creating something and then asking them what they think? Or are we being collaborative and inviting them to co-create questions with us? There's a distinction there for how much. And the way that this is applied, it's not as prescriptive as the culturally responsive evaluation approach, as you can see, but the way that it has a range. So you could be who controls it, like the left column would be the evaluator. All the power lies in me. I get to make all decisions, versus community, where community gets to lead most of the design of the work. And so that's the range. It's not as detailed, but it's a really helpful framing for how you might develop your work. Okay, and then the other thing I just want to mention about this evaluation approach is that it stems from these social justice paradigms. If you all know Paulo Freire concepts, education liberation, it's also embedded in that literature as well. So the other thing I wanted to highlight is just what are the differences between a participatory evaluation, similar to the principles or the one I just showed you, and a conventional evaluation design. And so hopefully you can see this table. I tried to make it as big as possible, but the first difference is who gets to drive the evaluation. And so for a conventional evaluation design, which you've probably seen, always just the evaluators or the program managers, folks who are just like implementing, and not necessarily the people on the ground or the people who are most directly affected, as it would be in a participatory evaluation design. And then if you just go down the list, a lot of this captures where power typically lies. So community members would determine the questions that get into a survey. So what does success look like? They get to co-define that with you. There's also a shared responsibility in data collection. The questions that are most appropriate when we do a participatory evaluation is related to trying to capture the perspectives of the people that are affected. And this is really relevant when we're trying to understand equity. Like, are there differences in accessing this service? Those are the types of questions that would be most appropriate for a participatory evaluation design. The costs are another huge distinction. As you can imagine, a participatory evaluation, if we're engaging with people, is very time consuming. It does, we want to ensure that we're offering compensation for those that we're engaging. And so it has and it requires more planning time, more self-reflection of yourself as you're engaging in that work, skill sets. So there are costs to it that will need to be considered as you're making the decision to embed this approach or not. But the benefits, I would say, outweigh the costs because the impact that you're making is deeper for the society, for broader society, but also the populations that you're trying to improve these social conditions for. So it's just a really helpful way of thinking about the key differences that might stand out. And this applies to both the participatory piece and being culturally responsive in the way that you develop your evaluation design. Okay, I'm gonna go over this slide and walk through my example of, okay. I'll just quickly mention, this figure here shows a continuum of engagement and thinking about how when we engage people using CBPR principles, we have to be mindful that there's diversity in community members, there's different levels to community members, and all the layers outside, the words that you see outside, trust, history, relationship building, those are all these factors to keep in mind as you're thinking about how engaged people will be, regardless of what design you use. So if you are just involving people to just get their reactions on something that you've designed, you'll need to be mindful of trust and how that plays a role in your engagement process, history in terms of whether they have had evaluations go wrong in the past, or your connection to that community. Relationship building is another central factor to consider, transparency, respect, and cultural humility. So these are just some, I just wanted to share this with you as a resource. It's from Dr. Kent Key about, what is important in terms of ensuring that equity, diversity, and inclusion is, and I know these concepts might look differently in your setting, but what equity considerations are needed as we're making decisions about when to engage with people. And so it's a little bit far off of the evaluation approaches that I shared with you, but it's just a really helpful, it's a really helpful paper that explains some of the core equity related factors to keep in mind. Okay. So I want to walk through how I've applied a culturally responsive evaluation approach. I know this was a quick overview and may not necessarily gotten the message across to you, but how I would walk through my project applying this design. And this is a real world project that I did with the county. And, I mentioned that we would start with trying to prepare for the evaluation. So stages 1 and 2 is something that this is where the arrow is. There's my arrow. So 1 and 2 are really interrelated and interactive. So when I apply this in my own work, I find that I can't do one without the other. I have to start with both as I'm preparing for the evaluation. And what that looks like is, I would go out into communities, start doing this outreach activities, begin learning about the organization itself and the history of them doing this type of work, who was involved in the program that I'm trying to evaluate. That's something that I seek to understand. Which communities are they reaching? Which are they not reaching? So it would look like calls. I would have these calls with folks, just asking questions, just trying to learn more about what it is that they've done already and how it's been going, very informally, so that I can begin to prepare an evaluation design that gets to their priorities. I don't want to create an evaluation that doesn't get to anything that they need. So it's really important that I start preparing for the evaluation by learning about the organization themselves and engaging with partners along the way. And so I actually also attended team meetings for this organization, just so I could hear how the agenda items were going, and just trying to show face so that I can build those connections. And we all worked at the same organization, and I was an internal evaluator, but we each had different teams and divisions. So I would start going to those meetings and making those connections with folks at the county. At the same time, I had a role of establishing a community advisory group. And this was a very new county that I had moved to. I didn't have any of those community connections yet. And so a lot of this work of doing outreach activities, going to community events was important so that I can start building those connections, and ensuring that we started the community advisory group at the beginning, at this phase where I'm preparing for the evaluation. I didn't want the advisory group to happen at stage 3 or 4. I wanted it to be from the very beginning. And so some of that work was, starting to outline a community charter for what the expectations would be for this community advisory group. And in addition to making those connections, establishing compensation. And that's a completely separate body of work, but just to give you a general idea on if you are embedding an engagement group as part of your evaluation, there's a whole body of work that needs to happen at this early phase of the work. The next phase is identifying the purpose of the evaluation. So similar to how we would be preparing, I started to invite program staff to share. And I did this by sending a survey, or maybe in those informal calls, what they thought would be useful for an evaluation. What are some of the questions that you have that I can help answer? So that's basically the gist of the conversation. I was trying to understand what is left for us to be able to understand better to make your work more successful. And so I actually put together a worksheet using some scoping questions for evaluation, and invited all the teams to participate and tell me about their work. What were their goals? What have they already measured? And what would success look like, so that I can get a better understanding of what this evaluation could be designed for. And so with that, I was able to get a better idea on the scope of this work, or this evaluation design that I had. These are the types of questions that whether it's formative or impact. At the time, they had already delivered the program, so formative wouldn't have made sense. But did they want to capture process, outcomes, something else? And so just really hearing from them first was important as I was designing the work. And then I was embedding these feedback loops to ensure that there was alignment with what people thought would be helpful for an evaluation. So as if you do qualitative coding, I was just doing a very informal, rapid qualitative coding of the responses that I would receive and prepare like an initial draft of what that evaluation scope would look like, and just inviting people to tell me what they think along the way. And also I had about 18 teams in this evaluation, just to give you a more concrete picture of how much work went into this process. So for about 14 teams were part of this program that I was evaluating. The next stage is really about framing the questions while also maintaining that culturally responsive lens. And so what that meant was, as I was able to identify my community advisory group, worked with the community advisory group to co-create some questions that would be relevant for the evaluation that we were trying to accomplish together. And so I had an initial set of questions, working with the community advisory group through Jamboards and Mural on how to tailor the questions to get to the needs of communities. So I had those different levels of input. I had the teams that I was working with to ensure their lens was embedded in the work. And then I also had community members who were part of the county. There were county community members from different neighborhoods, zip codes, who were also giving me their perspective on the question design. And then once I had the right questions, I had to come up with how we would collect the data. And so I'm a mixed methods methodologist, so I do quantitative and qualitative work. I'm very passionate about doing it that way. And so I was really trying to advocate for both, and being mindful of the different ways that people would like to answer the questions that I had. Someone mentioned surveys earlier. Here, being culturally responsive is really about thinking about whether surveys are the most appropriate for the communities that I want to reach. So I had proposed collecting stories through calls, interviews, looking at documents, archival documents, and just being really inclusive of what types of methods people were already used to reporting their data. Reporting their data. So some teams had just been documenting things in an meeting minutes, and that outlined all the activities that they had been doing. So that was an easy way of just leveraging what they already had and capturing that in the data collection approach. It was also important to be flexible in how I was designing the evaluation. So I still embedded these CBPR principles, but it was really in a developmental evaluation design. And what that means is that we start from a place of where the program is currently. This is how the evaluation is going to be. This is the scope of the evaluation and the type of evaluation that we're doing. But the program itself was iterative and dynamic, and so it might change. And so a dynamic evaluation approach helps capture that. It's a little bit off topic, but just to give you an idea of how important it is to maintain a flexible design. And a lot of the approaches that I shared with you earlier get to that. And just maintaining that ongoing communication with timelines, with what we thought was being incorporated in the data. And so I'm not sure if I'm communicating this enough, but a lot of this work in being culturally responsive across these steps is having conversations with the community advisory group and also the teams that you're collecting the data from. So we're having these consistent points of contact to hear their input on what needs to be tailored, what do you have already happening that I can leverage instead of burdening your day or your practice. And so it's really about that practice component that's part of the evaluation itself. Adapting and the instrumentation is another key step here, and being culturally responsive here meant tailoring the surveys that I had developed. And so I have an example of what that looks like in the next slide, but it's just an example. So I had a survey about these different components of sustainability. And so that's what you see about organizational capacity, and then all these items below and the rating. And I had a team who just didn't understand the questions and needed a facilitator with their team to discuss the questions and provide that context. And so I created a interactive version of the survey so that I was responding to what worked well for them, and just making it more interactive and being there as a resource for them. And so that's just an example of how you might embed a culturally responsive lens where you're leveraging their needs and preferences to the extent that you can for capturing the data that you need to capture. And then the other activities I had to do was collecting input for language consistency. So something that we had come across in that survey is that certain terms were inconsistent across the team. So just thinking about language and how important it is to not just making sure that it's not harmful language, but also meaningful language so that you're getting the answers that you need from the people that you're trying to reach. Of course, always involving the community advisory group. So they were involved in providing feedback on the overall process, the instruments, telling me, giving me input on the timing. So I had estimated a certain amount of time for completing these activities and just hearing their input on whether that was accurate, feasible, what were ways to make it least burdensome. So they were a critical partner in designing and adapting the instrumentation. Collecting the data. So once, and this is all related to what I've just been talking about, but just being really thoughtful of setting expectations and transparency for what's to come. So before I actually sent the survey, I ensured that everyone understood that a survey was coming. It wasn't going to be a surprise to anyone, and ensured that I was a consistent point of contact if they had questions about the survey. And so it's really about setting the data collection up in a way that you're being culturally, not just culturally inclusive, but also collaborative. It makes a difference when you're a point of contact. If I have questions about a survey and I can talk to you about it, versus I just get a survey in an email and I have no idea what the context is, and I'm just not going to fill it out because it's not important to me and I don't know the meaning of it. But here it was really important for me to establish that we're all in this. We all have a vested interest in this data collection, and here's why. And so just making that connection for others was really important. And then I had also translated some material, myself and a team, translated materials in the language that they needed to collect the data. So we were doing interviews in Spanish, and had some East African populations that needed materials translated and what that meant. And so just being mindful of how we're conducting the interviews and or the surveys. And just if there's either language translation needed or if you need an interviewer from that cultural background. So I had hired 2 students who would help with the interview process so that could dispel some of the power that we might come across as we're collecting data. And then, of course, analyzing the data. So with a community advisory board, you usually share the results with them and get their perspectives on what's missing, what would help tell the story better. And so this looks like additional conversations. For me, it was a presentation where I shared preliminary results and then had people share their thoughts in terms of why are we seeing these patterns. It's called a data walk, where we have people see the results, or a data gallery, see the results and then react to it and give us a better story of why, so that we have that context about the data. So that's something I had done here. And it's also a form of being culturally responsive, where we're trying to capture the stories or data or responses from the data collection in a more accurate way. It's more accurate to the narratives that we're seeing. And the last piece, dissemination. When we are applying this approach to dissemination and aligning with the CBPR principles, it's always a priority to share the final report or the final product to the communities that, or the teams that, or whoever it is that the program members that you've been involving, just make sure that you communicate that end result with them, because something that I've heard often is just how important that through line is. Like, you know, if I'm invited at the beginning, I give you input, it's really meaningful for me to understand how and where that input is applied. And so this last step is really about tying that, it's not a knot, but that full circle where someone understands that, you know, you listened, you applied what you've heard, and this is how it was applied in this final product. And so this was another session, another meeting where I shared back results with both the director of the program that I was evaluating and the community advisory board. So that's kind of the overview of applying this into your own, into a project of mine. As you can imagine, it was very hard and time consuming, but so meaningful. It made every aspect of the evaluation design so much more successful. You know, if I had just developed a survey and not asked anyone their preferences, I don't think I would have gotten any responses. And so being culturally responsive is just it's really about seeking to understand what works well in that community, what are the capacities that they do have, so that you can develop something that reaches that context, or aligns with that context and sets them up for success in responding to that with you. So it's the overview. So I have the activity next, but I want to pause here and ask if there are any questions or other thoughts on what I've shared. Oh, yes, Karis.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. Mhm.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was super helpful. I find it really aligns to the work I'm doing. One question I have is about focus groups. So in collaboration with our community partners, we created the questions for the focus groups based on like the CFIR framework. I guess it says framework already in there, but regardless. And, you know, we planned everything together, but now that the recruitment has gone out, we've had such low rates of people actually signing up for the focus group. So I'm wondering what you would advise as like next steps. Like I've already sent out, you know, 2 reminders, and I'm going to be meeting with our community leaders in the coming weeks. But you know, I'm just wondering what you would do, because everything was planned, you know, in collaboration. They've had, you know, it's been a true partnership, but now we're kind of getting stuck with the actual recruitment for the focus groups.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, sometimes it just happens. But
Yeah.
my questions for you are, you know, how did you plan the recruitment in terms of the communities that you want to participate in those focus groups? Like if you're trying to do focus groups with Latinx populations, like are you designing your outreach strategies in a way that is getting to them in a meaningful manner? Like every community is so different, right? So if I work here in this community and I know that a lot of the Latinx populations go to churches or other faith-based organizations, I might make sure that I reach out to those faith-based organizations and provide my recruitment letter to them in some way. You know, just as an example, are there places where those populations that you're trying to reach into those focus groups, where are they? Like, what are those community-based organizations?
So basically, I work with childcare organizations. So like I'm trying to recruit their staff members. And so I'm working with the supervisors. And so this is sort of where there's a discrepancy, because it's the actual staff members that just aren't signing up, even though I'm working with their supervisors and managers and like people at the leadership levels.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a different question then. Okay. So that might apply for this, because I experienced something similar, and that's why I had to really tailor things. So some options you might have, is there a team meeting that you could just join and take over, that they don't mind if you ask a few questions. Maybe you won't do your full focus group. So maybe you can ask 2 questions in an existing meeting that they have, whether it's like that team or the bigger organization team. Like sometimes they have organizational meetings with lots of teams at the center joining. So you could do like instead of a focus group, maybe it's just an input session where you pose
Yeah,
open.
that's a really good idea, because I know they do have those team meetings, and we have like other meetings with their staff members for like training and coaching purposes. So I wonder if I could just sort of commandeer the first 20 minutes or so. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's a matter of being flexible,
Mhm, for sure.
definitely not going to get at this point. I hope you accepted it. It's
Yeah.
your focus group, as beautiful it might be, it's just not going to work. And it's where can we be flexible in making it work for the priority populations that we're trying to reach? And that's
Maybe it's about like not just doing a focus group, but like, because we've had 4 people sign up at different times, like maybe it's one-on-one interviews at that point,
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
I see Emily has her hand raised.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I was not looking at the right screen. Yes, thank you. Emily, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
Oh, hi. Sorry. I think I put my hand up and then my computer froze. I was just curious. Sorry, I was just curious, and I don't know if I missed it. Thank you for the presentation. But with your advisory group, is there do you incent them? Do you incentivize participation, and how does that look? And sorry if you said this already and I
No,
missed
I left that out. I did compensate, and that's a whole other, that could be a whole other presentation. But I did compensate. I mean, I would advocate for compensating community advisory group members.
Mhm.
There are some recommendations out there
Okay.
regarding how much and what you need to consider. Do you have like a specific question about the compensation or?
No, like I was just wondering about it in context of how that money usually flows, like if it would be from the organization for whom you're doing the evaluation, or if it would be through grants that you get to do your work, but obviously it really depends on the situation.
Yeah, it could be both. Yeah, it could be both. Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes it's easier from the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
So,
you may have those policies in place and all of that.
yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
I see Christy has her hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. Tatiana, I'm wondering if you can please elaborate on making the survey or evaluation about organizational capacity more interactive. You mentioned that you did this to help participants understand the questions, but how exactly was it interactive? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, some of this all sits in my memory in my head, and so I appreciate you asking me to elaborate because I have lots of details on it. It's just not sitting there. So what this looked like, so this was originally a survey. It was a Microsoft form. That's what you can see, the copy paste, a snapshot of it. And what I heard from certain teams is that they just felt very hesitant. This was about sustainability of their program. So I'll admit that I also got a lot of hesitation about answering those types of questions. And so it was really important for me to facilitate what the questions were trying to get at and some of the caveats that this wasn't to take away any resources. It was really trying to support their program. And so I was invited to join a team meeting where this is actually a slide deck. So I took a picture of the survey, and that's what you see on the left, but on the right are these boxes that they can move into their responses. And so I was at a team meeting, there was maybe 8 people, and I would facilitate each question. And so this domain was about organizational capacity. It's from a sustainability survey. And the question gets at, do we have the support to do what we need to do? And then it gets to all these different nuances of that type of domain. But what I would do is facilitate what the domain was about and ask people to move their responses for each of the items, so the boxes, to the right rating. And then if they had questions, they would write into the question box. So on the bottom, it's a question box, and you could actually write text in there. And so I would you just walk them through how this was interactive. And so I would explain everything, ask them to move their little thumbs up to where they thought the response fit best for their experiences, and then just have them write any questions. So it was it was actually a slide deck that helps you use it in different ways, like helps you move the things in different
I
ways.
see. I see. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. It was just something I came up with. This is just, you could probably do something easier. I was just, because some people didn't. Yeah, I was just trying to be creative, I think. I don't know why I elaborated so much on this, but that's the idea. And you can be as creative. Like, you can be as creative as needed if you know that it'll be more engaging for people, that if maybe it's more fun for people to answer this way than a survey, So I think that's what I was trying to accomplish.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the time, Tatiana. I know that you had planned an activity for everyone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I wanted to see if we could get to that, and perhaps rather than a breakout, we could keep everyone in the same room.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Good. Okay. All right. So I have a group activity. We don't have much time. So that's good, but that's good. These are new concepts and we can work together. So the group activity is giving you a scenario. And we'll read the scenario. And I'll give you a moment to read the scenario, but the idea is that we are working towards the early phases of designing and evaluation that will be focusing on the well-being of Indigenous youth in Oregon. It's the premise. What we want to do is we want to assess whether, well, actually, we want to engage people from the community, from the Indigenous communities in our project. We really think that if we engage them, our evaluation project will be more meaningful, more culturally responsive. And so we really want to try to identify who those people are. Now, the question is thinking about what would be the first steps if we apply a culturally responsive evaluation approach. And so I'll stop here and let you read, but I just summarized it for you, but I'll give you a minute to read through it. Okay, if you're done, just give me a thumbs up, or if you got the case scenario, if you could, or chat. Oh, I realize I don't have faces. So I'm not sure if I saw thumbs up, but I'll assume that there was.
There were thumbs up, I can guarantee. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I have too many screens. All right. So we got the gist of the scenario. Now I'd love for us to think through, what are some of the activities that we would be doing, similar to how I walked you through my project example, if we're applying culturally responsive evaluation in stage 1 of preparing the evaluation. So I have, this is just a screenshot. Let me stop. Actually, I have a Jamboard here. Make sure I can share. Excuse my tabs. With the link. I'm going to send this link in the chat, and hopefully that works for you. And so I would love for us to just focus on stage 1, given the time. and just think through what kind of activities you might do for this particular scenario. You want to prepare for the evaluation. What would you start doing? And I have some examples here. So I put, I would really want to understand the communities that I'm trying to engage. So we mentioned that I'm just saying that now we are part of that scenario. So we want to engage Indigenous communities in our evaluation project. So I need to understand their cultural background, their cultural history. What are some of the issues that they face? So I might do, an environmental scan, or, look at the organizations, and maybe they have listening sessions available. Take a look at the websites that some tribes may have as part of their government. Like, are there certain organizations that I can reach out to? So just doing that exploratory phase of wanting to understand the communities first. So that's my first step. And maybe I would review the proposal. So if we're going for this evaluation project, and I need to prepare for it, I need to think about what's feasible. Do I have the money to engage people? And if I do, how many people can I engage? It's kind of the activities that I want us to think of. So you can go ahead, and if you haven't used this before, you can actually just click this Post-its and put your own responses. So we'll start with just stage 1, preparing for the evaluation. Or we can also talk through it if it's more helpful.
I feel like I would give some consideration to like how the project was designed, like how they originally designed it and what consultation went into that, and like if anyone was involved in that from those communities as well, to know sort of your starting place.
Yeah. So maybe that's right, Emily. Thank you. So maybe how project was designed, understand the starting place. Also, how evaluations have been used in this space before.
Mm-hmm.
So really it's a lot of understanding the baseline of what it is that we're trying to do as part of this evaluation. Anything else?
I was gonna say, kind of building off of that. I don't know Oregon like demographics super well, but I would want to clarify if the project's looking at like all of Indigenous youth in Oregon, or if we're going to be targeting like one specific community. Just because there's going to be various, essentially, each community is going to have different answers to all of those questions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. I'm just writing down what you're saying. That's especially important for this scenario, right? Understanding what the scope of the project is actually saying, like of that evaluation, in terms of whether it's all groups, certain groups, because who we engage will need to be representative of that, population that we're targeting, and recognizing that there are different perspectives and lived experiences and priorities and needs in those different groups of Indigenous communities in Oregon. I also am not familiar with which ones, other than the tribal government ones, the tribal nations, but that would be important for us to think about and make decisions on. And maybe that'll go into, like, I put the middle here. Because as I mentioned earlier, engaging partners will be part of preparing for the evaluation. What about engaging partners? So the second stage of a culturally responsive evaluation framework is engagement. And what kind of activities, if you're designing this for your evaluation, what will you need to do to get started to engage partners? David, I think it was David. David's response is our starting point. You know, we want to understand who first.
I think not only understanding who, but how it mutually benefits them in terms of evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly from an academic standpoint, we benefit from the information that we're gathering. Many of us go off and, you know, publish these sorts of findings, but for the purposes of the community, how can they be utilizing or leveraging those findings for the purposes of benefiting the programs that they offer or future initiatives?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And setting that early is so important, right? We want to make sure, and it could be in conversation with the partners that we do engage. Like, where are the opportunities that we can help support and close in on?
I think also understanding like how we want to engage them in relation to, like for example, if we're going to be doing like advisory committees or working groups or something, do we want to have a youth focused or like a youth only group to get their insight? Because you might get different feedback if it's youth only versus youth and adults or elders or community leaders. Do you want to have like an adult one and a kid one and a hybrid one, or kind of like your approach, and then understanding how that's going to change like the data collection, how they're going to evaluate, or how you're going to establish your evaluation pieces, pros and cons of those. And then also the financial aspect of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at this point, we might think about how to engage as we're preparing for the evaluation, but also making decisions about how these different audiences that we may engage will require a different data collection approach. So like you mentioned, youth, elders, those are going to be completely different approaches in terms of what's appropriate and what they might find more responsive for their cultural context. Yep. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karis. Thanks so much. Okay, well, I can't believe time flew. So I think this will be open for you to continue practicing, just thinking about where culturally responsive lens might fit into each of these phases. So thank you so much. And I'll pass it back to Priscilla for closing us out.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for joining us today. We certainly will be inviting you back to continue the conversation around evaluation engagement. This is solely just an opportunity to lay some foundation and introduce some of these key concepts to folks in the audience and those who will be watching this after the fact and stimulating the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. This is our final Trainee Hub before the summer break, so please stay tuned for more postings as we near September with our next cycle of offerings. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining today, and we'll be circulating a post-evaluation and look forward to your feedback and continuing to improve the Trainee Hub and its impact. So thank you very much for joining, everyone, and have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.